100 years ago, nobody cared about Ukraine or its disappearance as an independent state, swallowed up by the newly born tyranny of the USSR as it flexed its imperial muscles. But that has now changed. Putin's Russian world revanchism and violence have accelerated the evolution of Ukrainian identity and increased the pressure for social, political, and economic change. Perhaps the most perverse Russian invasion narrative is that Ukraine is not old and is not distinct from Russia in any way. But Ukraine is not just a footnote to Russian imperial history. As a nation, it is old, different, and diverse. And at the end of the war, Ukraine could prove to be the rock upon which the decrepit, brittle hull of the Russian imperial ship tears itself apart and sinks from history. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. All our content is also available on popular podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Please like and subscribe to help new people find our fantastic speakers. And if you enjoy the content, please consider becoming a patron. Dr. Sasha Dovzhyk is a London-based author from Zaporizhia and a special projects curator at the Ukrainian Institute in London. She holds research affiliations with Goldsmiths and Birkbeck University of London. Since February 2022, she has divided her time between London and Ukraine. Sasha has written on topics as diverse as the legacies of Chernobyl, transnational decadent aesthetics, and Ukrainian literature for various publications, including the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Guardian, CNN, The Ecologist, Open Democracy, and many others. Sasha regularly gives public talks, interviews, and moderates events on the topics of Ukraine's fight against Russia's invasion and Ukrainian traditions of resistance. Sasha, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a huge pleasure to be here.
Well, hopefully I got most of that intro right, and there was a lot more I could have put in there, but let's jump into the questions. You describe yourself, I think, in your Twitter profile as a Ukrainian killjoy, and really this is the first question, Cassandras and killjoys. Ukraine historically has been the bearer of bad news, and to an extent, you've been telling us about what Russia has become for a long time, and perhaps we have not been listening.
I probably have to divert into personal history here, why Ukrainian killjoy. So when I was writing my PhD in London, there was a war going on in my country. So it was after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And I was the person who would destroy any chit-chat or any light party conversation with a reminder that there was actually a hot war going on in Europe and people were dying in Ukraine. This was not what people wanted to hear back in 2015, 16, 17, 18. And they suddenly awoke to the idea of an open armed conflict in Europe in 2022 when Russia started bombing Ukrainian cities. And yeah, Ukrainian killjoy is something that I still identify with strongly, and it allows me to say that I'm on brand. I've warned you that the content of this particular conversation would be grim. And I think it applies to Ukrainian culture in general. Ukrainian Cassandra is par excellence, is probably Lesya Ukrainka, the key canonical Ukrainian author, a feminist and anti-colonial thinker whose work Cassandra is a reworking of the myth of Troy from a feminist perspective, from the perspective of the Trojan tragic prophetess Cassandra, who always knew the truth but was never believed. And of course, it is painful for Ukrainians to be in this position these days where they feel like they've been warning the world about, sorry, that's an air raid alarm. We'll try to mute it a little bit, but if I'm interrupted by sirens, I apologize.
If you need to go to a shelter, do what you need to do.
Thank you. I think it's okay for now. Yeah, so Cassandras of Ukrainian literature with Lesya Ukrainka as their leader have been a thing for a while. Lesya Ukrainka warned us in particular about Russian colonialism, the danger of being enchanted with this greatness of Russian culture. In her poetic drama Boyarinya, the noblewoman. It's one of the poetic dramas of hers that is actually based on Ukrainian history, on Ukrainian context. It tells us about the tragedy of a Ukrainian woman in the 17th century who's brought from Ukraine, where she has her agency, she is active in public life, in political life even. She's brought to Muscovy as a wife, where all her functions are reduced to just that, a wife. And she makes all these astute observations about the difference between Ukrainian and Russian culture from the feminist point of view again, and it's very revealing to read that even now.
And that was very innovative, isn't it? Because she's actually writing, not in the late 20th century, but a long time ago.
It's the beginning of the 20th century, and all her observations are still quite valid. She makes all the points that are now like common points of conversation. I actually have a gift for you. I have a gift of a quote from one of her letters, which I translated, and it actually refers to the praised greatness of Russian culture. So the quote comes from her essay, which she published in 1896 in French. It's called The Voice of One Prisoner of Russia. And in it, she reacts to the celebrations of a visit of Nicholas II to France in 1896 and to all these grand celebrations of a Russian emperor there. So she addresses her French readers with some of the thoughts that we today will find relevant. So she writes, "My glorious brothers, do you know what squalor is? The squalor of a country which you call great. This is your favorite word, the squalid word greatness, the taste for which the French are born with. Yes, Russia is huge. One can send a Russian into exile to the end of the world without throwing him outside his country's borders. Yes, Russia is huge. Starvation, ignorance, criminality, hypocrisy, and tyranny with no end in sight. And all these great misfortunes are huge, colossal, and grand." So these are reflections of a turn of the century Ukrainian author who felt imprisoned inside the Russian Empire.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, that echoes, talking of Cassandras, one of my favorite travel authors who I'd occasionally quote at parties is a French aristocrat who survived the French Revolution called the Marquis de Custine, who was also gay, and you can imagine being in the 19th century. He was rather a sensitive personality and extremely perceptive of both human psychology, but also political psychology. And he traveled to Russia in the mid-19th century, I think it was, the 1840s. And as an aristocrat, he was actually welcomed into the inner court circle. So he got to see the sort of life which other people didn't. And was an extraordinary reflection of the quote you've just read and many of the things he said, the corrosive influence on all types of freedom and expression. And there's a lovely quote in there where he talked about Russian nobles coming to court, dropping pearls and vermin, which is fairly brutal. But that's an extraordinary thing. And like your sort of Cassandra qualities, I'd always turn up at parties and talk about Russian imperialism and Stalinism, like the like the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, the kind of unwelcome wedding guest. And people would say, come on, lighten it up a little bit. But here we are, we now have a full-scale war in Europe on the scale of World War II. Ukraine is defying all predictions in not just surviving, but in pushing Russians back. How do you explain the various strands of Ukrainian sort of culture and society that's contributed to this extraordinary resilience to hold your own and eventually, I believe, be victorious in what is an extraordinary large scale and horrifically brutal war?
I think that the roots of Ukrainian resilience are in Ukrainian history. We've been dealing with Russian imperialism and with various attempts to make us extinct for quite a while, for 300 years. And there are some strategies that are hidden in Ukrainian culture, like this resilient vibe, if I'm allowed such an expression. So since probably the founder of Ukrainian literary language, Ivan Kotlяревский, who wrote Aeneida, sort of a Cossack retelling of a Greek myth of Aeneas. We have humor as one of the coping strategies. And then through history, we had literary figures like Taras Shevchenko, who was again warning us about the dangers of like imprisonment inside an imperial culture and was fighting with his words for Ukrainian liberation. It continued through the 20th century with like writers like Lesa Ukrainka, but also what we call now the executed renaissance of Ukrainian writers. So we always have this amazing culture to fall back on. What Russia tries to accomplish these days is not only to turn Ukraine into this deserted land, the barren fields, the wild fields from the 16th century mythic maps, but also to instill this image in public mind that Ukraine is nothing but this barren field, that there is nothing here, there is no culture. It's just this empty land to be invaded and conquered. What we have to do in response is just to preserve our culture at the threat of this destruction, to keep fighting for our culture and to remind ourselves and everyone around us that this culture exists and has been keeping afloat in much starker circumstances. What our ancestors could not accomplish, was probably because they did not have statehood behind them. Today, Ukraine has a state, and it allows us to fight for our survival much more efficiently. And of course, another reason why we are so resilient is the fact that we have no choice. What else is there for us? We either resist this genocidal invasion or we just cease to exist. And if faced with such a choice, a person grows up quite quickly and stops cherishing these infantile dreams of like appeasement, and just faces the fortune and fights for survival, because there is honestly not much else to do.
And one of those traits is that, of course, you can see the process of Russian imperialism and, of course, cultural imperialism and what its intent is. And the intent, of course, is to create an imperial culture that transcends all the national cultures. And then once that happens, it's to eradicate and annihilate anything that provides, call it a first tier competition. They can tolerate second and third tier, lightweight literatures and identities, but not something that that threatens to challenge or even exceed the quality. How on earth did this Ukrainian cultural identity survive these extraordinary processes, say in the 19th century, and then the Holodomor, the destruction of the Ukrainian sort of renaissance of literature in the 1920s, and then the absolute brutal centralization of the Soviet Union, which turned everything into a kind of shade of gray?
Mm-hmm. I don't know, maybe the honest question is, I don't know. It's a miracle that Ukrainian culture did survive, and Ukrainian authors cultural practitioners managed to preserve their culture under such circumstances. And we know that today this process continues. Just the most recent event in this chain of destruction is the murder of Ukrainian writer Victoria Amelina by Russian missile in Kramatorsk, where she was researching Russian war crimes. And it happened quite recently on the 27th of June. Victoria fought for her life for a number of days, and eventually she died on the birthday of another Ukrainian writer killed by Russians, Volodymyr Vakulenko. Volodymyr Vakulenko's diary of occupation in Izum, in Kapitolivka, the village where he lived, was unearthed, uncovered by Victoria Amelina, who, she did dig out the diary in the backyard of Volodymyr's family house. And it was very important for her to actually find that diary. She knew of its existence from Volodymyr's parents. And while she was digging it, she left us this testimony that she felt that she was unearthing all the buried Ukrainian manuscripts, all the buried and unwritten Ukrainian texts, all the Ukrainian cultural reaches that had been erased by Russia for decades, for centuries. And her particular effort to preserve Ukrainian culture was sort of encapsulated in this fact of uncovering Volodymyr Vakulenko's occupation diary. She did that, and the diary is now published, and I believe it will be published in English with Victoria Amelina's forwards. And this is one of the acts of Ukrainian perseverance and insistence that we must preserve this culture, and we must pass on the torch, so to speak.
And Victoria, for those who aren't familiar, I really encourage you to look up her story. An extraordinary, she seemed to burn brighter, and her words had a kind of, I won't say harshness, but had a sort of cutting edge of truth to them and a fury behind them. And it's a horrible irony that she, of all people, should be cut down by the Russian rage and aggression. Nonetheless, hopefully her words will sort of burn bright. And one point I was going to raise is it would be fantastic to get her works in English, because I was trying to look them up. I don't think a huge amount has yet been sort of translated, and that's perhaps in her memory something that needs to be brought to a wider public, especially for myself. I don't read Ukrainian, unfortunately, so I'd love to be able to experience those in a really good translation. But it's not just her creative life that's cut short. We also have Lyubov Panchenko, starved to death in the early months of the invasion, a famous Ukrainian artist. We have the home of Polina Raika destroyed by the Kakhovka dam flood. And I'm sure there are many dozens of other names of artists and writers whose work have been destroyed, whose apartments, archives, collections have been damaged and destroyed, and individuals. And of course, we extend that to music and many other disciplines. This is a terrible, terrible price that Ukraine is paying. And yet Russian culture is not sending any of its creative people to the front. It's sending, to an extent, its worst people. It's sending people who are either criminals or people who are politically neutered, in the sense that they probably, this is going to sound extraordinarily harsh, they would not have actually added all that much to Russian culture. I know life is important, but in terms of cultural loss and the scales, it's very much weighted in Ukraine's loss and not Russia's there. Does all of this horror also provide an impetus to strengthen Ukrainian culture and perhaps even some kind of sort of rebirth?
It's hard to answer this question. That would be my short answer, and my longer answer would probably start with this point. Although we are drawn to emphasize the importance of Russia's killing of our cultural producers, of our artists, of our writers, because these are sort of Ukrainian voices, and they, as you say, burn bright, and they're very prominent. And perhaps it resonates because they are people of our circle and our community. It's not only that Russia is killing our best. What do we mean when we say our best? I know of 19-year-olds who have not been yet able to accomplish much, and who have been killed by Russia in this war, and their loss to their parents and to us as a people is not no lesser than the loss of prominent Ukrainian artists and writers. I know of people that nobody will ever remember because they were just ordinary Ukrainians living in villages, and yet they took up arms and they sacrificed their lives for me and for people like me and for all of us, basically. They defended us with the price of their lives. So I don't know, the challenge here is to remember everyone and try not to single out people whose lives feel more relevant for us because we do similar work. I don't know how we will be able to accomplish this, how we will be able to actually commemorate all these sacrifices. But this is the challenge we are faced with right now. I will not probably find the answer to this question in our conversation, but I will keep looking for it.
Because that's right. I mean, people like farmers, software engineers, innovators, or people who are just, fantastically good at whatever job they do. I mean, that's the difference, isn't it? People are drawn from all walks of life, every village, every town, every sort of social level. Whereas the Russian conscription seems to be a form of genocide against its own people largely drawn from ethnic minorities, from poor areas, those who have no agency, no voice, those who had no sort of political education as such, or are less likely sort of to question the orders they're being given. It's sort of horribly reflective on the differences between the two societies, isn't it?
Russia finds its people disposable and we don't. And it's been clear for quite a while. I'd like us to go back for 10 years, bear with me, to the point which still broke Ukrainian history in a way, in the history of the region, to Maidan, a protest which started in November 2013, when Ukrainian then President Viktor Yanukovych decided to turn the country's course from pro-European alliance and align the fate of the country with Russia. There was a number of protesters, most of them were students, in the center of Kiev at the Maidan Square. The then President Yanukovych decided to show them. And he ordered Ukrainian riot police to beat them up. And the footage of that beating of Ukrainian students, mostly, on the news the next morning was so shocking and so painful. We couldn't breathe. It was so infuriating that the next day, 1 million people went out to the streets of Kiev in protest against the police violence. It was because like a dozen of students were beaten up in the center of Kiev. Ukrainians could not allow that to happen in their capital, in their country. It was outrageous. People rose up in response to that. 1 million people went out to protest. And since then, like every Ukrainian loss was mourned, since the first protester was shot down in the center of Kiev, to the first deaths of Ukrainians during Russia's invasion, when Ukrainian defenders started being killed there. we mourned every loss as our own because it is our own. We value those lives that are being sacrificed for our freedom. We cannot allow our freedom to evaporate and to turn into like this authoritarian state. And in Russia, they've lost how many? I don't keep count anymore. To 250,000 people. And there is nothing. The voices in protest that we hear are just like they are so few that they only emphasize the absence of protest in Russia.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It's like 10 to 15 times soon the losses in Afghanistan. And during the Afghanistan war, there were protests, there were mothers' committees, there were voices raised. It almost suggests that Russia was more socialized, that Russia had more of a nascent civic society towards the end of the Soviet Union than it does now. And that perhaps for me is the most shocking aspect of the whole thing. And of course, the pernicious effect of propaganda and how, despite to our eyes, how crude it appears, how effective it actually is.
I'm not here to like offer my thoughts on the state of Russian civic society. I think it's non-existent, and it's evident for all of us that it's non-existent at this point. Russian society probably doesn't exist. Apparently, they're so atomized, and their voices are just this is probably one of the reasons why we don't hear them. But honestly, at this point, how do I say this politely? I don't care. I don't care about the state of Russian civic protest, the absence of their resistance. I just try to concentrate my efforts on preserving this fighting spirit within my community, to make sure that I do everything I can to for Ukrainian victory. Basically, it's like, it sounds too loud, but this is what like everyone here is involved in.
It's only natural. I mean, it takes so much energy, so much perseverance, I would imagine, to just get up every day and fight day after day after day in the face of the horrors that are going on. I guess you have to pick and choose your battles and where that energy is going to be expended. And one of these areas, of course, is the changes happening around the Russian language, which you have written very eloquently about. And Russia's brutal invasion has prompted a lot of people to reassess what for many of them may have been their mother tongues they're brought up with. They may not have had ambiguous feelings about this language or really questioned its use until recently, but you've been documenting a huge change in attitudes and behaviors around Russian language use in Ukraine.
Yes, that's right. So Russian was my first language. I'm from the Russian-speaking supposedly Russian-speaking region in the southeast of Ukraine, from Zaporizhia. I was brought up in a Russophone family, and I apologize for the tram outside of my window. Sorry for the sound interruption.
That's atmosphere. It's great.
Yeah, welcome to Kiev. It's either air raid sirens or the tram for now. So I was brought up a Russophone Ukrainian, although Ukrainian was the language of my schooling. But because of the Russian imperialist narratives ingrained in Ukrainian culture at the time when I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, Ukrainian was associated with this kind of provincial language of farmers, of peasants, not the language of high culture. And I was a presumptuous kid, and I was into high culture, so I chose Russian as the language of exploration. And language predefines your choices, basically. So the literature that I was interested in was the Russian classical literature. And I grew up reading Dostoevsky and Bulgakov and all the imperialist writers who actually denied my culture and my people the right to exist. And it took me years and decades to realize that this course of action was actually imposed upon me by Russian imperialist project. And that, and I started exploring Ukrainian culture through language like later in life, in my 20s. And the definitive point in me switching to Ukrainian was the Maidan revolution again, and the Russian invasion of my country in 2014, when the language question was used as an excuse, a justification for this invasion. So Russians basically told me that they invaded my country militarily in order to liberate me, a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, from like Ukrainian neo-Nazis who conducted this coup in Kiev, who was also me, because I was part of the revolution that took place in Kiev at that very point. So this schizophrenic turn of Russian propaganda made me realize that they could weaponize my first language, and that I would not just voluntarily give to them this weapon, and that I had to turn to Ukrainian language and to start using it as my first language, and to reject the Russian because it was the language with which they basically came here to kill me. I think this turn was quite commonplace for many Ukrainians in 2014, but it's become even more relevant today in 2023. Kyiv, which has been for a while a bilingual city where Russian and Ukrainian existed on par, today it sounds more Ukrainian than Russian to me. Obviously, everyone understands Russian, but not too many people will respond to you in Russian.
That's right, and many of the people I've been interviewing, I mean, I have had that challenge sometimes where people's English is not great. I don't speak Ukrainian, so but some people have an extreme reluctance, and that's not surprising. It must bring a certain amount of pain. I think the phrase you used is the language has turned to ashes in people's mouths, which is a very visual metaphor for that.
And it's also grounded in the reality that I witnessed in Ukraine. So while you drive through villages in the Russian-speaking eastern part of the country, the villages that have been razed to the ground by Russian fire, by Russian artillery, the villages, the towns that do not exist anymore. This ashes metaphor is not a metaphor anymore. They literally erased Russian-speaking villages with their Russian-speaking population from the face of the earth. This is what Russian liberation means, apparently.
And the horrible irony, I think people now have a much better awareness of the geography of Ukraine than they would have done previously. But many of those cities that have suffered the most, Dnipro, Mariupol, and others were predominantly Russian-speaking cities. Kharkiv, although they're not erased, has been seriously damaged, and that's one of the horrible ironies of this conflict. And of course, the Kakhovka Dam, again, predominantly Russian-speaking area, and now Zaporizhia under threat as well, with the atomic power station there. You've also written eloquently about that. Do you feel Russia stepped back from the brink? And more widely, if they were to destroy the nuclear power station, people, I think throughout this war in the West, and they always struggle to place some kind of logical arguments over things. They try to deconstruct things as if Russia's every act is somehow strategic. Whereas to me, it seems that there's a lot more there of scorched earth, envy, hatred, which, in Russian, zavist and nenavist. I think those are two concepts that you have to grapple with to understand, to an extent, what Russia is doing. If we can't have this, neither can you. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
It definitely looks like that to me, and we should not also discount Russian stupidity and ignorance. Let's just remember the astonishing fact that Russian troops invaded the Chernobyl exclusion zone in the north of the country at the start of the full-scale invasion. And they were the ones to dig trenches in the Red Forest, which is famous for burying nuclear waste and being one of the most polluted areas in the world. And I think it's known by every school child in Ukraine, but it was apparently not something on the mind of the Russian invaders when they dug those trenches in the Red Forest, and when they invaded and occupied the Chernobyl nuclear plant. The fact that a number of them, and we will not know the exact number for years, I guess, got radiation poisoning from that adventure is quite telling. In Ukraine, the fact that the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe did take place on our Earth, and it polluted our land, and it was the direct result of the Soviet policy and Soviet ideology, is known by most of us. It's a fact of Ukrainian memory, collective memory. In Russia, these things do not exist because they happen elsewhere. They happen on these colonized territories. They do not enter the national narrative. They do not enter collective memory. They do not enter the schooling, apparently. So the Russian ignorance in matters concerning like radiation awareness, basic like recent history is quite apparent. So it is quite clear at this point that Russians have mined the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and that they probably they use this as a leverage. They use this as part of their nuclear blackmail. But let's just not discount the fact that they just might blow it up out of their own stupidity, ignorance, and lack of awareness of what they're doing. The fact that they were allowed to occupy the site of civilian nuclear infrastructure is basically something that should put all of us to shame. It is our collective global responsibility. We were not prepared for this, and we are still not prepared to face the consequences. What the International Atomic Agency is doing, and what Mr. Grossi has been doing for a year and a half of Russian occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, is a nuisance. It's not a valid response to a terrorist act at the site of a civilian object of nuclear infrastructure. And I don't see that the world is actually prepared to grow up and address this challenge posed to us by Russians.
And I'll ask in a minute about the cultural impact of the trauma of Chernobyl, because it's very deep in the Ukrainian psyche, and as a free culture, there's a lot of works dealing with that, both artistic and literary, as well as Sergei Plakhy's extraordinary book. But one thing just to mention at this point is that despite sanctions against Russia, one of its largest industries is its atomic industry, and Rosatom is not sanctioned. And this is an abiding mystery with me. I don't understand what's going on behind the scenes, or why their nuclear industry is allowed to continue around the world to pitch and invest in very substantial infrastructure worth many tens of billions.
Thank you for mentioning this. Rosatom was among the first Russian enterprises that should have been sanctioned clearly after the occupation of the Chernobyl nuclear plant or the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. So we're talking the beginning of March last year. And it has not happened. It is allowed to function, and it is allowed to send their specialists to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, where the torture, kidnapping, bullying of Ukrainian personnel is taking place. It's all part of their operating of the occupied nuclear plant, and we still allow them to continue without any sanctions, without any repercussions. And this is part of Russian impunity. They feel encouraged to do what they are doing because we are so meek in our response to their actions.
And in terms of the impact of Chernobyl on the Ukrainian psyche and culture, there are a lot of works, a lot of responses. And so you say people are, these things aren't buried for political reasons. So people openly discuss What is the importance, do you think, 30, 40 years on from Chernobyl, on Ukrainian culture?
It's very interesting. We probably have to go back to the fact that the catastrophe at the Chernobyl nuclear plant was one of the reasons why Ukrainians found their political voice at the end of the Soviet era. The explosion and the poisoning of Ukrainian land and Ukrainian people was among the reasons why Ukrainians started this huge ecological movement, which was interlinked with the literary movement and with political activism, where Ukrainians just said that, okay, probably Russian dominance in our country is what will either kill us off or we will put an end to it. And this was one of the reasons why Ukrainians galvanized their political life, their political protest, which eventually led to the dismantling of the Soviet Union in 1991. And since then, the impact of Chernobyl has been lingering in Ukrainian culture, in Ukrainian literature, even in those works that do not discuss the impact of the explosion directly. You can still feel this sense of living next to a huge catastrophe, which is indescribable, unimaginable. You cannot see it, you cannot touch it, you cannot smell it, but it is here, and you are responsible for it. I can recommend an essay by Oksana Zabushko, one of the key Ukrainian literary voices, called Planet Polin, Planet Wormwood, in which she describes this apocalyptic feeling of the end of the world, basically, which redefined her political, social, cultural awareness. She felt responsible not only for her life, but she felt responsible for the lives of other living creatures. And this is the break of this anthropocenic worldview where human life is at the center of our values and the rest just are disposable. And I think this ecological consciousness has been reawakened in Ukraine because of the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe, and now because of the blowing up of the Kakhovka dam in southern Ukraine.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that something local that's very tangible to people should then spark the more sort of abstract collective interest in politics, but perhaps that in hindsight is natural. And what other role do you think is played by the fact that Ukraine is a colonized, or was a colonized peoples, as opposed to the colonizers? There seems to be some strong parallels between, let's say, the Irish experience, the Ukrainian experience, being dominated by a strong, aggressive imperial power with, to an extent, a weaponized culture. I mean, English literature and culture extremely strong, but another imperial culture. And you see the same strains of dark humor, irony, wordplay, and so on in Ukrainian literature as you do in Irish, and also this extraordinary, vibrancy and, dare I say it, lust for life. As someone who sort of, travels between two worlds, Britain and Ukraine, do you see, parallels in the culture of other colonized people and their experiences?
Definitely, there is the gallows humor, which probably comes from the fact that you are always on the side of this, not the ones who come here to conquer, but the ones who come here to resist. And you cannot allow yourself to be subsumed in grief. You need to just keep the life going. It's one of the facts that always surprises me in Kiev and Ukraine. Like, nobody talks about whether they were woken up by explosions last night. It's just dull. It's just social incompetence. It's like talking about the weather in England. Yeah, like rain falls, bombs fall, but but the life is still here. Let's keep it going, and let's just not be boring about it. And another recent example is that we can make jokes at funerals of our friends. Recently, as we've mentioned, we buried Victoria Melina, and at her funeral, another fantastic Ukrainian writer, Olena Stashkina, spoke. And she made a joke, and I actually did burst out laughing while crying. She said that they discussed death with Vika, obviously, as everyone does here. And Vika said, I would be so canonized, I would be so angelic if I die, that at my funeral people would be disappointed if I don't rise straight from my grave. And that was funny. And we did laugh while crying. Humor is a great anesthetic, and I think it's true for the Ukrainian culture as it is for the Irish culture. It is true for like the experience of Black Americans, for example. Is something we often discuss with my Black friends, that this gallows humor is something that have been keeping enslaved people's minds put together under the most terrible circumstances. I think that this gallows humor is definitely one of the features of the colonized peoples or colonized social groups that keeps them going. Think about queer culture as well. The humor in queer community, it is so vibrant, and it is also used as a weapon against those who try to disperse this social group.
And the last question is probably quite an abstract one, may be difficult to answer, and that is, if we go from that sort of humor, that survival humor, it's quite possible that at the end of this war, when Ukraine emerges victorious, you are not going to be on the edge of the world, but you're going to be sort of, put the phrase here, sort of dancing on the edge of freedom. You're going to be the front line of those societies that revere life, freedom, democracy, historical memory. And now we're seeing quite clearly you're on the front line of society which has an amnesia around all these things. And in fact, actively tries to destroy relationships between humans, emotional relationships, political relationships. Ukraine is not only going to be bringing the sort of joy and strength to Europe, you are also going to be clearly defined as the front line, the kind of great wall between what we term these civilized values and Russia, which has descended into a deep and dark barbarism.
I would just change the tense of the verbs here. I think we are that already. It's not in the future, it's happening here and now. I think we are the edge of this fight for freedom in the world currently. And it is felt by everyone here in Ukraine. Also, part of my job is helping foreign journalists who come here to cover the war. And what the smartest among them tell me is that it is in Ukraine that they actually feel alive, as opposed to their native countries, because here you really feel the price paid for freedom, for life, basically, for you continuing your life in this world. You feel the price and you cherish it, and it is cherished here more than in any other part of the world. And that is probably why Ukraine is so precious now. People here are the grown-ups of Europe because they know the price paid for their continued existence. And we will continue making it clear for everyone around us. We will keep being Ukrainian killjoys, and we will keep knocking the doors and telling everyone, yeah, remember who's fighting here for you, for your continued existence.
Let's remind us not to take everything for granted, including our freedoms and when we descend into a sort of tribal political discussions and we attack each other, I think it's worth looking at Ukrainians and seeing how you've overcome these sort of personal and partisan differences to pull together.
Yeah, thank you. I hope this will be the case. It's hard to be a lesson that someone else should learn, but it's probably one of the sub-products of being a Ukrainian these days. We would very much prefer to just stop, being an inspiration for everyone around us and just go back to living our life. But yeah, this is the case currently. I feel inspired by my fellow citizens very much. This is what keeps me going every day. Their resilience, their resistance, their humor, and their fight for freedom.
Well, Sasha, it's been a tremendous pleasure talking to you. I very much hope we get to have that experience again and dive into other topics. But this has been tremendously interesting, and I know the audience are going to massively appreciate your insights. Thank you so much, and stay safe.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you for having me. It was so delightful to speak to you, and I hope to see you in Ukraine.
Yes, definitely. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!